It's good to be here and to talk about my book. Very briefly, my book is mainly about the first 3 years of Margaret Thatcher's premiership, when she and the government adopted the doctrine of monetarism as their way of regulating inflation and the economy. And my thesis is broadly twofold. It didn't work, although inflation did come down, but it didn't work in the way that monetarism said it should work. And secondly, the attempt to make it work caused considerable damage to employment and the economy. That said, there had to be a deflation of demand and a deflation of the economy and increased unemployment if inflation was to come down. But as I argue in the book, it went too far. And one of the main reasons for that was that monetarism, as expounded at the time, wasn't working. The monetary aggregates were creating a false indication of what was going on in the economy. I'll come back to that. Let me just talk a little bit about the battle of ideas. I went to Cambridge in the early 1960s when Keynesianism was the dominant doctrine of the time. Keynesianism was at its zenith. Maynard Keynes had only died 15 years earlier. King's College, Cambridge, is where he spent his career. And there were many of his students and followers working there. Dennis Robertson, James Mead, Joan Robinson, Richard Kahn, who invented the multiplier, and many others. So it really was a hothouse of Keynesianism. And it was the doctrine of Keynes that as an undergraduate I mainly imbibed. And without being didactic, just very briefly, Keynes's discovery, if you like, was to show that in an economy where wages are sticky, it is possible to have considerable unemployment and output operating below potential for a considerable amount of time because of a lack of aggregate demand. This was in contrast to the classical theory, Say's law, which said that output creates its own demand. Keynes challenged this and showed in his most famous book, The General Theory, that it was possible for there to be a mismatch between supply and demand. And it was the job of government, the appropriate job of government, either through fiscal policy or monetary policy, to make good. Fiscal policy by increasing public spending or reducing taxes, monetary policy by reducing interest rates. However, he didn't believe that spending was very responsive to interest rate adjustments. And therefore, he rather downgraded monetary policy. We learned about monetary policy, but we were told it wasn't important. And that if you wanted to stimulate the economy or prevent the economy from boiling over and creating inflation, it was fiscal policy, that's spending and taxes that you had to operate on. Keynes wasn't too worried about deficits because provided the deficit was internally financed by bonds sold locally within the country, then the extra liabilities of the government and interest payments are exactly matched by the increased assets of people in the country. Different if you're borrowing from overseas. In our studies of monetary policy, we were told about something called the quantity theory of money. And on the whole, the prevailing view was that quantity theory didn't make any sense. Keynes had dismissed the quantity theory. Just to remind, perhaps in Buckingham, I need to explain what the quantity theory is.
Go on, please go ahead.
Quantity theory starts with a very basic equation. MV equals PT. That's quantity of money times the velocity of money equals prices times output. So this is an identity. it follows that if the velocity of money is constant and the quantity of money increases, then on the other side, according to this theory, if you believe the causation goes this way, then PT increases, that is to say, nominal income. And the quantity theory of money, which goes back to the 19th century and the early 20th century, said that the prime influence went from money to prices, that output was very largely unaffected, except in the very short run. So the prominent textbook at the time in Cambridge was Paul Samuelson's Introduction to Economics. Samuelson from MIT dismissed the quantity theory. He said it was a historical curiosity, a blind alley. It might have been relevant in regard to the import of gold from South America and over the long term, because he agreed that there was a correlation between money supply over the long term and prices. But as an explanation over anything but the very long term, he dismissed it. And the reasons were as follows. First of all, he argued that velocity of money was unstable and unpredictable. And if the velocity is unstable, then you can't have the left-hand side of the equation, mv, resulting in a proportionate increase or decrease in nominal income. James Tobin, who taught me at Yale, looked at Milton Friedman's monumental history of money in the United States, which just came out in 1963 in my third year at Cambridge. And Tobin showed that out of the 93 years of American monetary history that Friedman had looked at, in over half, the velocity of money was outside 90% or 110% of trend. So he argued that the velocity was unstable, therefore couldn't be relied on. Secondly, Keynes, followed by Tobin in America, argued that except when the economy is running quite hot, that the prime effect of a change in the money supply was on output and not on prices. Thirdly, there was the argument which was promoted a bit later by Nicholas Coldor, that the causation didn't run from money to nominal income, it ran from nominal income to money. And these critics questioned how exactly an increase in the stock of money could translate into spending. Now, Friedman had written a very important article in, I think, 1970, where he argued that that people have a tendency to want to hold a particular stock of money in relation to their income and wealth. And if it went out of kilter, then they would spend. One of my tutors at Cambridge was Joan Robinson. She thought this was bunkum, and she called it a mystical, here's one good phrase. You may not agree with it, but this is what she said. She said, Friedman has there's this unearthly mystical element in Friedman's thought, and his view that the mere existence of a stock of money somehow promotes expenditure. And then there's the problem of how do you define money? Is it cash? Is it cowrie shells? Is it current accounts? Is it deposit accounts? So the whole question of what exactly is money, and then how do you control money? Now, in the classical system, money was controlled by central banks by having a fixed ratio, telling the banks they had to have a ratio of cash to deposits. But by the 20th century, most of money was being created, and is still to this day, is created by banks in making loans. So as we were to discover, much later, when we tried monetarism, control became a real issue. And last of all, the classical contention and Friedman's contention that fiscal policy was powerless. We can come back to discussing what was the argument for that, but the classical economists and the quantity theory and Friedman all said basically you couldn't do anything with fiscal policy. All that fiscal policy did is if, for example, a higher deficit was funded by the sale of bonds, there was complete crowding out of spending. If it was funded by the monetary system, by being monetized, it simply added to inflation. So there we were. In the mid-60s, the dominant flow at Cambridge and at most universities was against quantity theory and against what, by the end of the 60s, was being called monetarism. So what happened in the 70s? The 70s was a very bad period for the British economy, for the American economy. Things began to go pretty haywire. If you look at one of the charts, if you look at the first table, you'll see what was going on between 73 and 79. GDP per capita in Britain was going up by just 1.5% per year. Manufacturing productivity was pretty much flat. Price inflation was 15%. Much worse than Germany. And what had become clear by the 70s was that the Keynesian diagnosis was no longer working. Keynes had said that if you had inflation, the way to deal with it was to cut back on demand. If you had unemployment, the way to deal with that was to increase demand. So what did you do? We didn't know what to do. We were caught. And as students, we became aware in the 60s that, or we were taught at any rate, that inflation was due to two things: excess demand and or cost push. Cost push coming from producers charging monopoly prices, or more significantly from monopolistic trade unions pushing up wages. So you had cost push and demand management, but it didn't seem to work. So what was going on was that both in America and in Britain, governments took the view that demand management had to be joined up with incomes policy, either statutory or non-statutory. And we in Britain tried incomes policy from the mid-60s onwards, right through to the late 70s. At times it worked, at times it broke down. You had inflation taking off in the mid-70s to 25%. You had unemployment beginning to creep up, nothing like what it did in the early 80s. And so there's a general questioning of the Keynesian orthodoxy. There had to be something different. So there was an appetite for a different approach. Milton Friedman in America was very persuasive, and he was joined by several economists in Britain, including Professor Congdon here, who played an important role in the mid-70s in promoting monetarism. So the existing orthodoxy of Keynesian demand management and incomes policies weren't working, so there was an appetite for something new. And I have to say that Tim and various others were persuasive and created a climate that was persuasive with the Conservatives in particular from 1975 onwards. Not that Labour had totally ignored this swing. In 1976, Labour, under James Callaghan, for the first time published a monetary target. This was partly at the behest of the IMF, who in 1976 made a large loan, the largest loan ever made up to that time to Britain to stop the economy from collapsing. So we had a monetary target for the first time. Dennis Healey didn't believe in monetarism. He was the Chancellor, but he introduced targets because he thought the financial markets wanted it and the IMF wanted it. And then we get to 1979. Over this period, incomes policy, 75 to 79, incomes policy was the way that Labour government sought to regulate inflation, and it was quite successful. They did a deal with the trade unions, which said if you limit your wage claims to such and such percent, the government will provide various tax breaks, etc. And it actually worked. Inflation came down from 25% in 1975 to it's about 10%. In
78, inflation came down to single digits.
No, exactly, single digits. So you know, from 1976, although I was doing macro policy in '76, it was a very tense moment whether we would go with Tony Benn and cut out imports and try and go it alone, or go with the IMF. We went with the IMF, and it seemed to work, and the trade unions went along with this. But then we get to the winter of 1978-79. Callaghan is facing re-election, and he decides that if he's to be re-elected, we have to get inflation down to 5%, keep it there. And the only way he thought he could achieve this was by having a wage norm of 5%. This was a time when actually inflation was still running about 8%. And this turned out to be a huge mistake. Those of you who are old enough to remember, this was the winter of discontent when we had massive strikes across the public sector. In October 1978, Callaghan and Healey announced a wage norm of 5%, which would be for the public sector, and for the private sector, if companies didn't stick to it, then there would be penalties. Well, in November 1978, Ford workers across the country were awarded 17%. From then on, it couldn't hold. And trade union leaders, to whom Callaghan was quite close, came in and said to him, "This isn't going to work. You're going to lose the election. You're going to have massive strikes." But Callaghan put his head down, encouraged by Healey, and said, "No, we're going to stick to 5%." Well, the rest is history. Callaghan was defeated in May 3rd, 1979. In comes Mrs. Thatcher and her government. Now, as I said earlier, the Conservative leadership was impressed by the movement towards monetarism in the late 70s. I don't think Geoffrey Howe was entirely convinced, but Keith Joseph, who was Margaret Thatcher's mentor, was certainly convinced, and he and one or two others like John Biffin pushed it very hard. It was pretty clear by May 1979 that a deal with the trade unions was not feasible. So income policy would have been very difficult to continue. So what was the new government left with? The new government was left with the need somehow to get inflation down. And they chose monetarism to achieve this, monetary targets. There were two kinds of monetarism I felt at that time. One was what Nigel Lawson would later call primitivist monetarism, which held that there was a direct link, and a very quick link, between money supply and inflation. If you reduced money supply by growth by 2%, then inflation would come down by 2% very quickly. And this was Mrs. Thatcher's view. She took a quite extreme view. It was her conviction. It wasn't science. It was her conviction that this had to be the case. On the other hand, there were more practical monetarists, and I'll quote Paul Volcker, who at the time was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who believed in monetary targets, but he took a much more, if you like, eclectic view. This is Paul Volcker writing in 1978. I believe there are, in fact, a variety of non-monetary cost and supply factors that can affect the rate of inflation in the short and not so short run. To say that the price impact of such developments can always be offset with suitable monetary adjustments seems to me to display an enormous faith in the flexibility of prices and wages over meaningful periods, or a magisterial indifference to the potential implications of cost and supply developments for real output in the face of restricted monetary growth. I see no need to accept as complete or even adequate a simple causal explanation running from monetary behaviour to price behaviour. I think that was a pretty fair judgment. And although at the time I wasn't employed as a professional economist, I was basically the bag carrier for Margaret Thatcher. I was her intermediary between herself and the Treasury and the Bank of England. But I was the only trained economist at 10 Downing Street. Extraordinary. So you have a Prime Minister who is adopting a very newish doctrine, or an old doctrine, but in new clothes, who had very strong views on it, but she preferred not to have an economist working for her as her advisor. I was a middle-ranking civil servant. I wasn't supposed to be an economist, but because I was the only trained economist in that building, I felt bound to offer her help as best I could. I wasn't a primitivist monetarist. In fact, I was a skeptic. But I went along with it because it was the policy of the day. And the job of a civil servant in the British government is to try to make the strategy that ministers have adopted work. And I did my best to do that. But very soon, it became fairly clear it wasn't working. The Treasury and Margaret Thatcher, remember, she was very involved in economic policy at that time. Very involved in the setting of interest rates and monetary policy. In those days, interest rates were set by the Treasury and by the Prime Minister, not by the Bank of England. So every decision on interest rates was taken with her and by her. And I'll give you an example of her belief. After 6 weeks, the government introduced a budget, which included it included an almost doubling of VAT from 8 to 15%. And at one stroke, this was likely to increase inflation by 3.5 percentage points. And I pointed this out to Mrs. Thatcher, and she said, "Oh no, it's all right, we'll just control the money supply, and it won't happen." And I said to her, in some usual deferential way, I said, "Prime Minister, I don't think it's going to work quite like that." She said, "Well, let's see." I mean, it was that sort of gung-ho attitude. And likewise, in relation to public sector pay, Mrs. Thatcher had unwisely agreed to implement the recommendations of a commission set up to make recommendations of public sector pay. In the run-up to the election, she said she would implement them. Well, these recommendations were coming in at between 15 and 25%, and the government implemented them. And this too made the monetary target very difficult, and the inflation goals very difficult to achieve. So we found ourselves by late 1979 with the money supply going way over target. And because of the belief in the monetary targets and the need to control them, interest rates were pushed up to a record level of 17%. Base rate went to 17%. And at the same time, the exchange rate, remember North Sea oil was coming in? The exchange rate was going up. So you had extremely tight monetary conditions. Although the money supply looked as if we had very loose conditions, because money supply by this stage was going at around about 20%, just below 20%, which suggested that money conditions were very loose. In fact, because interest rates were sky high, because the exchange rate was sky high, financial conditions were pretty loose. Now, you'd have thought the way things were going, that the government would have sort of asked for a rethink. Not at all. Mrs. Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe decided to batten down and go even further and introduce a 4-year rolling monetary strategy, meaning targets for 4 years, 4 years ahead. By the time we got into 1980, inflation was running at 22%, which was almost double what the inflation rate inherited. And this is because of the carry through from the winter of discontent and the VAT increase. So it wasn't good. It was a very difficult time. Up to that point, the cabinet had never really been consulted on the strategy. It was just the inner group that pushed it through. There was increasing unhappiness within cabinet, but there was no going back. It was only towards the end of 1980 that the dam, if you like, began to burst. Mrs. Thatcher was getting increasingly worried about unemployment. She blamed the trade unions for the unemployment. She blamed whoever she could. She was getting pretty desperate, I have to tell you, because it wasn't working. But she blamed the Bank of England. She said, why aren't they controlling the money supply? She said, why can't they just turn the tap off? Well, it wasn't quite like that. And I had to explain to, in the absence of an economic advisor, I said, it doesn't quite work like that. The money supply, broad money, isn't controlled by turning off the tap by the Bank of England. So finally we get to 1981, and it was decided to carry on with the strategy, but to try to switch things so that the private sector was being less trammeled. I had personal experience of this myself because my wife's family had 3 textile mills in Lancashire. Because of the high interest rates and the high exchange rate, this firm went into liquidation. One evening, Mrs. Thatcher came down quite late. She said, I do hope your family firm is doing okay. I said, it's not doing okay, Prime Minister, it's gone. She said, can't we do anything for it? I said, no, we can't do anything for it. It doesn't work like that. So she was getting really, really worried about it. And so what we did in the 1981 budget was to increase taxes with a view to enabling interest rates to come down. And this is what happened. Taxes were increased by £3.5 billion, doesn't sound much today, but it was about 1.5% of GDP. And this made possible in the short term a reduction in interest rates, which did take some of the pressure off industry. That's more or less getting to the end of my story. But frankly, by 1982, the shine had really gone off monetarism as it was being applied. It had disappointed because, as I said, the money indicators, the money supply wasn't providing a good guide. Unemployment was over 3 million. It had doubled during Mrs. Thatcher's first 2 years. And most importantly of all, probably, Nigel Lawson, who was very influential in devising the monetary strategy, had turned against it. He decided that it wasn't working and we should do something different. And he became Chancellor in 1983, and from then on, it became a more eclectic policy. We started to look at the money supply, we looked at interest rates, we looked at the exchange rate. Some would say we looked at too many things and we lost our way. And it is arguable that back in the 1980s there was an unnecessary and inappropriate expansion of both money supply and the budget. Counting the cost. I have a chapter on counting the cost. Well, as I said earlier, deflation of the economy was necessary, inevitable, if there wasn't going to be an incomes policy. There had to be a reduction in demand to put downward pressure on prices and in particular on on wages. But the extra unemployment that happened was greatly in excess of what monetarists, or indeed almost anybody, certainly Mrs. Thatcher, thought would happen. I'll read you what Milton Friedman told the Treasury Select Committee in 1980. It was 1980. Incidentally, Marcus Miller from Warwick, who advised that committee in 1980, is here today. Might be able to comment on this in a minute. But Milton Friedman, perhaps you've got the quote, Marcus, yourself. You've got it here. Milton Friedman said, I conclude that only a modest reduction in output and employment will be a side effect of reducing inflation to single figures by 1982. Well, by the end of 1982, we did get single figures, but unemployment had more than doubled. And so the cost was very considerable. Why did the economy deflate? It wasn't entirely due to government policy. About half of it is due to the doubling of oil prices by OPEC in 1979, which removed quite a lot of demand from the economy. It was also due to the world recession of that time. But half of the deflation was probably due to government policy, fiscal and monetary policy. How much of this cost was inevitable? It's one thing to say that government restricted policy, but how much was actually necessary? And I tried to estimate very roughly what the unnecessary cost was. And my view is that because unemployment went up to over 11%, that inflation could have been brought down without unemployment going so high. Milton Friedman's, in my view, most important contribution to economic science was his invention of the concept of the equilibrium rate of unemployment, or the natural rate of unemployment. This is the concept that there isn't a trade-off between inflation and the rate of unemployment. There's a trade-off between the rate of unemployment and a stable or accelerating rate of unemployment. If unemployment goes below a certain level, then inflation accelerates. If unemployment goes above a certain level, then inflation decelerates. And by 1981, 82, there's no doubt in my mind that unemployment was above the level that was necessary for inflation to stabilize. And so I estimated that if instead of unemployment going up to 11.5%, we'd gone to about 10%, then we might have saved about 400,000 jobs. Not large in the total things, because the total, if you look at my table, look at table 3. Unemployment went from 1.4 to 3.2. So what I'm saying is, out of an increase of unemployment of 1.6 million over that period, perhaps 400,000 was unnecessary. But 400,000 is quite a lot of jobs, and there's a lot of businesses. So I think that's as far as I'll go for now. We could talk about the ex post critique, if you like, and talk about the legacy.
More happy. We'll do both. Thank you very much, Tim. So about the excellent summaries. Thank you very much. The main message of monetarism, or the core message of monetarism, is that provided that changes in money velocity are relatively stable. By stable, I don't mean that that velocity is fixed, but it changes on a predictable manner.
Right.
So it's mean reverting, if you like. There are ups and downs, but it reverts to the mean over time. Then, if we have continued excess in the supply of money, over the rate of growth of goods and services in the economy, that would be inevitably inflationary. Are we in agreement with this?
Well,
It's not, by the way,
This would
it's
be-
not automatic, by the way.
it's
It
not
takes time.
automatic. I mean, if you look at history, this is true.
Uh,
I mean, but to me, it's not clear how this increased stock of money converts into spending.
So that's what we can discuss, if you like,
Yeah.
in a bit more detail.
Yeah.
So, of course, this is not automatic.
Yeah.
First, the excess in the amount of money has an effect on financial markets. And it's very noticeable, isn't it? Whenever there's an excess in financial companies' portfolios, they diversify their portfolio, demand more other assets, and that increases the price of assets, basically. So asset inflation, basically.
Yeah.
That has implications on how much companies can borrow and individuals and spend. So after a few months or terms, if you like, that will be reflected in an increased level of consumption and investment in the economy. And ultimately, after a few terms, that it can take up to a year and a half or 2 years, that will have an impact on CPI inflation. That's the transmission mechanism that I believe is behind this model. So if we go back to the early 1980s, to the episode that you so kindly described to us today, true, money growth, M3 sterling at that time, exceeded the targets. That's a fact. But it did, the amount of money M3 did decelerate quite significantly since 1981. And the trend is very clear. You can see it in the diagrams Tim Lankester has in his book.
Yeah.
And then that happened right after 1981. Inflation peaked in 1980, and then sharply decelerated in the following 3 years to reach 4.6% in 1983. So it's true, of course, you couldn't be more right. The targets were not met, but there was a deceleration in the amount of money followed by disinflation, sharp disinflation. And this is what I would call, a good performance of a monetarist approach, in my opinion.
Yes, but it wasn't proportionate. That was because the velocity of money was falling. There was a fall.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure you're right on the lags. I mean, money supply growth peaked in late 1980 at around.
Well, the peak that I have, according to your diagram, is in 1981.
81 exactly.
And then they have a very sharp deceleration in the rate of growth of money afterwards.
But according to most monetarists at that time, it was thought that in the first 6 months there'd be an output drop, and it would take another 18 months for inflation to come down.
Up to 2 years.
So what I'm arguing is that actually inflation should have been, if you believed in the theory, inflation should have carried on in double digits through 83. It was very surprising if you really believed in monetarism that inflation had come down as far as 5. It was very good. It did.
Yeah.
I don't think you could get that from the numbers.
Well, just by checking the numbers that you have in your book, yes, inflation decelerated quite sharply in the years after 1981. But perhaps one of the reasons of this short-term phenomena is that, as you mentioned, money velocity had a sharp increase in the early 1980s. And I appreciate that with the change in bank regulation mostly.
Yeah.
But what we have seen by observing the data on a longer term perspective is that money velocity reverted to the trend after that. So, yes, indeed, there are changes in regulation affecting the amount of money, money velocity. But eventually, if you keep on increasing the amount of money in the economy or increasing the amount of money in the economy, it will be reflected in higher or lower rates of inflation. And then you couldn't be more right. There was a notable and very lasting, I would say, increase in unemployment, but concentrated in the industry and manufacturing sectors. Am I right? Mostly?
Mm-hmm.
So should this be attributed entirely to a tighter monetary and fiscal policy? Or were there not other much more structural problems affecting these sectors?
You're right. There were structural factors. I mean, shipbuilding, for example, was an industry I worked on, wasn't doing it well at all. We were being subject to competition from Korea and Sweden. And there are other industries which structurally were on the downturn. So I think it was a combination.
Okay.
I mean, the manufacturing you look at it's really extraordinary. You look at the level of manufacturing. You look at chart 4, at the bottom. Look what happens to manufacturing. It drops by about 17% over an 18-month period. I mean, that's very extreme. And it's textiles, automotive industries, engineering, etc., etc. Just going back to velocity, I mean, as you said, velocity went up in the 70s, but then it comes down quite sharply. And you're absolutely right that, I mean, over a period, there has to be some control of money, whether it's liquidity, blah, blah, blah. But it makes running a policy very difficult unless you can predict what's going to happen with velocity. And we couldn't predict it. That was the difficulty. And we should have perhaps. There was something called the corset. We regulated bank lending through controls over the banks. I won't explain how we did it, but it did put a damper on bank lending, and we took off the corset, and immediately lots of lending that had been going on between companies was re-intermediated.
And that happened in 1980, precisely.
1980, and that should have been forecast.
And that was reflected in much higher deposits in banks.
It was, exactly. There was a kind of blindness about this. Had we been more sophisticated in the way we operated, it might have worked better. And I remember Terry Burns, who became chief economic advisor, advising you should, and Alan Walters even, Alan Walters was the brightest of them all, I think. Alan Walters advising the Prime Minister, don't worry about month-to-month variations, it's okay. But she said, no, it's not okay, can't be okay. And the financial markets didn't think it was okay either. I mean, the city became pretty convinced by a fairly primitive monetarism. So you had a kind of a negative feedback.
I think, because I've been working very closely, to my disclosure, I'm very proud of saying, with the British most prestigious monetarists in the room, that's in London.
Yeah.
If I learned something, is that we never, obviously we paid attention to the monthly figures, monthly monetary figures, but we paid attention to trends, rather than just paying attention to one-offs, 1 month after the other. But the other point that I would like to raise before I open the questions, the floor to questions, is because you mentioned other experiences with monetarism in Switzerland, in Germany, during the Volcker period as well, and you call it monetarism with more flexibility. Is that a sort of monetarism you would have favored at the time? Or how different would it be from the one?
I mean, the fact is, we admired what the Germans were up to. We admired the Swiss, and when you looked at what they were doing, actually, it was a flexible monetarism, and so we thought they were doing the right thing. I think we should have been doing it too. But it was a hard message to get across. I think I certainly failed to get it across. I mean, I did my best as a middle-ranking civil servant to I suppose, to argue for a degree of flexibility. But my boss, who incidentally I admired enormously, I mean, for what she did for the British economy later on the supply side was extraordinary. I mean, don't think because I'm critical of that first period, the macro policy, that I didn't admire her for her fortitude, her integrity, and her desire to improve productivity, and her actually achievement in improving the supply side of the economy in later years. But she was very adamant and very unmovable. I mean, it would be hard to understand today how a prime minister would be so involved in monetary policy and its complexities. The number of times we had seminars around the cabinet table discussing the intricacies of monetary-based control and things like that, which well, Gordon Brown might have got his head around these things, but I can't think of any other prime minister in history who would have done that.
That's
so, her fortitude, her unwillingness to bend had great advantages in many respects, but in regard to monetarism, we suffered from that fortitude.
Well, actually, if you want to learn more about how much you praise Mrs. Thatcher for all her key economic policy achievements, you go to page 76 and onwards.
Yeah.
There's a long list.
There's a long list. Yeah.
My only caveat is that you don't perceive that list by saying that she managed to control inflation and to return macroeconomic stability, and perhaps that could have precipitated everything else.
Well, let me just comment on that. I mean, the defenders of Mrs. Thatcher, including herself, said, well, we got inflation down, so it worked. But Nigel Lawson, in his memoir, said this was the myth of a mythical monetarism.
I read it in your book.
We did get it down. The thrust of policy was correct, but it wasn't because of monetarism. I mean, dear Mrs. Thatcher, I mean, she was, in her memoirs, she said, let me just read this to you. She said, I wish I'd contributed to this particular chapter in the memoir, because it really is really misleading. She says, our success in bringing down inflation in our first term to under 4% has been achieved by controlling the money supply. Not true. I mean, we achieved it through deflation. The thrust was right, the spirit was right. John Hoskins, her principal policy advisor, he wrote in his diary, we tried to do the right thing, but we got it wrong. And then you've got Alan Budd, who was working at the London Business School. And he writes as follows, which is, I think, also quite interesting. Alan Budd. He says, monetary targets didn't really work because the relationship between the growth of the money supply and the growth of the economy was too loose. No reasonable person would think you can control the economy through monetary targets. This is one of the principal architects of the monetary strategy.
Well, before I ask Tim to say a few words about this, may I just finish with a couple of questions on the legacy part in your book. Yeah. I think that's the one which I really disagree with you, Tim, on. Yeah. I think you are too harsh on the legacy of monetarism. Yeah. Let's take the example of the latest inflationary episode after COVID. It is very much true that for the last 4 decades, the monetarism and indeed the debate on whether money should have any role in assessing macroeconomic outcomes has been or was largely disregarded by policymakers, by fellow academics, by policy commentators, and so on. But this is something that has changed, in my experience, in recent years, in the last 2-3 years. In my view, the latest COVID-19 inflation episode has vindicated monetarism. M4, the broadest monetary aggregate used in the UK to measure the amount of money in the economy, M4 grew at 50% per year. 15%, between 2020 and 2021. This means a rate 3 or 4 times higher than that before the pandemic. That's how large the increase in the amount of money was. The money velocity, as in the US and in many other economies, fell dramatically. Yes, it did in 2020. People, in a moment of panic, rushed for money. But then money velocity started to return to a much more moderate pattern in 2022. CPI inflation reached 11.1% inflation in 2022, the highest in four decades. So again, you have this correlation of excess in money growth in 2020-21, followed by an excess in CPI inflation 1 or 2 years later, once money velocity starts to return to something more normal. And that's regarding the explanation of COVID-19 inflation, but also now the Bank of England acknowledges money in the Monetary Policy Committee meeting as summary of the meetings in the minutes. Also, the Bank of England in the Monetary Policy Report now reports indeed on broad money growth. That's something they hadn't done it for decades. We have institutions like the Bank for International Settlements publishing papers on the relation between money and inflation. The same goes for the European Central Bank. The former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, was very critical of QE and the effect that it had on money growth, and that had accelerated inflation in 2021 and 22, and indeed much more interest by academics on the relation between money and inflation. But that's what I think really that your assessment of monetarism is not that accurate.
I won't go into this in detail. It seems to me that a lot of the extra inflation came from external factors, came from Brexit, supply bottlenecks, higher energy prices, which needed to be countered by tighter monetary policy. I mean, I would have thought the inflation would be, on your argument, Juan, would be running at a higher level now than it is. If money supply was growing at 15% in late 81, by 15%, actually by 2023, inflation was down around 5%.
It was going down sharply.
Yeah, it's going down sharply, and yet money supply had been at about 15%.
2 years earlier.
Yeah,
but that's the timing is important. It's 2 years earlier.
Yeah.
And then the bank, from 2022, started to cut down the amount of money in the economy.
The year from spring 22, there was no growth of money at all.
It was actually the destruction of money at that time.
Well, there was no the growth. It was just zero, basically.
Yeah.
No growth of money.
So,
broad money.
but talking about the exogenous factors that you are referring to, another economy, another open economy, indeed exposed to exogenous factors such as Switzerland, for example, very much affected by the war in Ukraine, the import of oil and gas from Eastern Europe. They did not suffer from the same rate of inflation as we did, and they did not expand the amount of money as much as we did 2 years earlier. So I'm sorry, I don't think everything is in this exogenous non-policy focused factors. That's why I'm pretty convinced that I've done some quantitative research on it, that if anything, COVID-19 inflation has vindicated monetarism, in my opinion.
But what about interest rates? I mean, the whole purpose of quantitative easing, which resulted in the expansion of money supply, was to get interest rates down, and to alleviate problems in the economy, because COVID was a tremendous shock to the economy. I think it was reasonable to loosen monetary policy in that way, to prevent output has been remarkably stable. I mean, when you think what happened in 80, 81, 2007, I think what's happened over the last 3 years has been pretty successful in terms of macroeconomic policy. I mean, if you look at the recovery after 2021, after COVID, it was pretty remarkable, actually.